Nolan Smith has the potential to be the next Haason Reddick, but do the Falcons already have their own version of him already on the roster?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, and of course your very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who can take you on that journey of self-discovery from wherever you are. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. And guys, we thank you for making this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is a mock draft Monday where I'll be talking about a potential option for the Falcons in round one. That will be Nolan Smith, the Georgia pass rusher. Later in the episode, I will be joined by Mark Schofield of SB Nation, and it will be part one of multiple parts where we talked about this year's upcoming quarterback crop, and we'll start the conversation talking about Alabama pass rusher Bryce Young. But without further ado, let's get into the conversation for Nolan Smith.
The 8th pick, the Atlanta Falcons select
Nolan Smith, outside linebacker, University of Georgia, and he's been a somewhat popular selection for the Falcons as of late. I've seen mock drafts with like Ian Cummings of Pro Football Network, Shane Hallam of Draft Countdown over the last week have Nolan Smith, as well as several others in the previous weeks. And we know that the Falcons need to address their pass rush needs, and we've seen Nolan Smith consistently climbing up the boards after an impressive combine. I think he said at the Georgia Pro Day back in March that he had talked to the Atlanta Falcons and they were sort of intent on keeping him inside the state of Georgia. Now, I'll believe that when I see it, but certainly gives credence to the idea that he may be in the mix for the Falcons with their top 10 selection. And going back to that combine, that very impressive combine, he ran a 4.3940 at Indianapolis scouting combine. And then when you adjust that for his weight at 238 pounds, right, and that's translates to a speed score, right? His speed score, certainly among edge rushers, was like top 3 at the combine, only behind Tommy Adebayo of Northwestern and Byron Young out of Tennessee. And you look at that speed score, it's only a notch or two below what we saw from Trayvon Walker and Jordan Davis, Nolan's former teammates at Georgia last year, who had incredible combine performances last year. And so when you look at Nolan Smith's 40 time, his broad jump, his vertical, his 10-yard split, all the speed, explosiveness, he tested in the 95th percentile or higher among edge rushers. The concern with Nolan Smith is while he has that speed and explosiveness, he doesn't necessarily have the size. 6'2", 238, 32 and 5/8 inch arms. His height is 15th percentile. His weight is 2nd percentile. His arm length is 17th percentile. So an undersized player, but a very explosive player. But he uses that explosiveness effectively as a pass rusher. You see the burst, you see the speed to win to the outside. I don't think he's quite honed that speed rush to be able to maximize it quite yet at the collegiate level, but that is something that you hope he can generate at the next level. And speaking of generate, he does generate force because he can convert speed to power, and force equals mass times acceleration. And while Nolan Smith doesn't have a ton of mass, he does accelerate well, so he does generate a good amount of force when he does want to use power. And those are kind of the building blocks that I think can turn Nolan Smith into an effective pass rusher in the future in the NFL. He's a high character football player, one of the leaders of that Georgia defense, kind of took over for Nakobe Dean this past year as sort of the leader for that team, a spokesman for the Georgia program. If you watched any of the NFL Network's combine coverage, he was selling Georgia to all recruits that may have been watching the combine. So certainly a great personality there from that. And you're hoping that that high football character, that makeup that we know that the Falcons love when it comes to the players that they wind up selecting and bringing in to Atlanta. You hope that translates into Nolan Smith putting in the time, the effort, the energy, refining his craft as a pass rusher, so that in the future, even if he's not quite there yet, he will get there eventually, refining the footwork in order to maximize that speed rush, learning better hand placement, learning counter moves, all those various things. He's not there yet, but he can get there. And I think the dream for Nolan Smith on what he could eventually be is very similar to what we've seen from Haason Reddick currently with the Philadelphia Eagles the last couple of years. And Reddick was a similar undersized sub 240 pound player entering the NFL initially. Because of that limited size, the Arizona Cardinals that used the first round pick on him wanted to make him into more of an inside off-ball linebacker. He didn't really take to that over his first 3 years. They moved him back to edge. Chandler Jones got hurt in that 2020 season, and then Reddick kind of stepped in, had 12.5 sacks that year, then went to Carolina the following year, playing across from Brian Burns, had 11 sacks, and this past year joined the Philadelphia Eagles and had a career-high 16 sacks and was very good, voted to the Pro Bowl, all-pro teams, all that various stuff this past year. And similar to Reddick, I think with Nolan Smith, who is, you can see that speed rush get refined and be deadly, right? That's what really Haason Reddick does. That speed off the edge, going up against right tackles, especially that tend to be still a little bit more slower foot than your typical left tackle, is certainly, I think, something that Nolan Smith, like Haason Reddick, can take advantage of. And especially when you have it, Haason Reddick in Philadelphia, where they have that interior push from guys like Javon Hargrave and Fletcher Cox and whatnot. And then here in Atlanta, where you're hoping to see with guys like Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata and potentially Calais Campbell, that interior push, that speed rush and that interior push really go together, because if the speed attacks to the outside, it forces the quarterback to step up into the pocket and he gets sacked by that interior push, or that interior push prevents that quarterback from stepping up in the pocket, and that speed rush can come around the edge with the quarterback deep in the pocket. And so that's the sort of combination that you're looking for with Nolan Smith here in Atlanta over the next couple of years. But I do think that's probably not going to happen immediately. That's something that you may have to wait the better part of 3 to 5 years. But in the meantime, I do think Nolan Smith is going to be a valuable contributor potentially to the Atlanta Falcons, a solid role player, a guy that's going to play on special teams. He did that at Georgia the last couple of years. And I think the type of scheme that the Falcons may be employing this year, especially one that utilizes a lot of stunts and twists, is going to be a scheme that will work for Nolan Smith because of that athleticism, that acceleration. If you can get him free, sort of looping on the inside, if you got Calais Campbell crashing and then you have Nolan Smith looping on the inside, I think he can be a very effective, role player in the meantime as he works to refine his craft. Now, let's move the conversation forward with Nolan Smith. And my main concern with him is I feel like you kind of already have versions of this type of player on your roster. Maybe not quite as good as Nolan Smith, but I don't know if that makes him as attractive to the Atlanta Falcons moving forward. Not to mention, my personal opinion is I think Arnold Ebiketie is a better overall prospect than Nolan Smith. And so you got Arnold Ebiketie in round 2, and maybe, we'll talk a little bit later about maybe that was later than Ebiketie should have gone, but it would feel weird to me to take a quote unquote lesser player like Nolan Smith with a top 8 selection. And we'll break that down and exactly what I mean by that as we continue today's episode. And this episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. You've heard me talk about how therapy has benefited me several times over the last several months, and that's thanks to BetterHelp specifically. Therapy has helped me understand that I can control only the things that I can control, and I can't control if the Falcons draft a good player. I can't control if they win a football game, but the thing I can control is the quality of this podcast, and I've gotten feedback from several of you guys over the last year that this quality of the podcast has gotten better, and a lot of that's thanks to BetterHelp. Therapy is about deepening your self-awareness and understanding, and BetterHelp is going to help connect you with a licensed therapist who can take you on that journey of self-discovery wherever you are. And if you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Discover your potential with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP fanduel.com/locked-on. So I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. And I want to give a shout out to all my everydayers out there that are listening every single day. We thank you for making this illustrious podcast your favorite podcast, your first listen of the day. And of course, you can find it on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. But let's continue the conversation about Nolan Smith. And essentially, the argument I'm going to make and why I'm not necessarily as big a fan of Nolan Smith for the Falcons, especially in round one, is I feel like you kind of already have similar players in Lorenzo Carter and D'Angelo Malone to Nolan Smith. Now, I expect Nolan Smith to be better versions of those guys, but kind of what my expectation for what Nolan Smith is going to give you in the early part of his career, especially as he continues to work and refine his game, is basically what you got from Lorenzo Carter last year, what you're expecting to get from Lorenzo Carter this year. And maybe you can say, okay, you got Carter on a 2-year deal, and by the time, that contract expires in 3 years, that's when Smith should be hitting his sort of stride. But I think you can make the same argument for D'Angelo Malone. And again, I think Nolan Smith is better than D'Angelo Malone, but I feel like D'Angelo Malone is probably giving like 70, 75%, maybe potentially of what Nolan Smith is going to bring to the table. And so because of that, I don't know if Nolan Smith is as valuable to this specific team as he might be for another team that doesn't necessarily have that guy that has that speed and juice off the edge to be that speed rusher. And I don't know if that's a guy worth a top 8 selection when you have similar players. You compare and contrast that to Tyree Wilson of Texas Tech, Miles Murphy of Clemson, Lucas Van Ness of Iowa, some of these bigger edge rushers that may be on the Falcons' radar at the top of the draft. And while I might think, overall pound for pound, Nolan Smith may be a better prospect than one or more of those guys, in a vacuum, I feel like the reason why the Falcons would be attracted to those specific guys over Nolan Smith is because they don't really have that player. Those guys would be basically their version of Cam Jordan moving forward, and you don't have that type of player on your roster. And while you do have two quote unquote lesser versions of Nolan Smith already on the roster, and do you want to pay a premium price for that to get a slightly better version of players that you already have, that premium price being a first round pick? And maybe your mileage will vary on that notion, but for me, I'm not necessarily as gung-ho on that. And while I think you're hopeful for Nolan Smith to reach these heights as a pass rusher, it's not guaranteed. And a lot of that is due to the fact that there just aren't that many sub 240 pound, or 240 pound pass rushers that are successful in the NFL. Right. And now I'm going to invoke the name that I'm sure is going to cause some of you guys to swerve off the road, or you may trip on the treadmill when you're working out in the gym listening to us. So I apologize for that. But, I'm just preparing you ahead of time. Let's talk about Vic Beasley for a second and the comparisons between Nolan Smith and Vic Beasley. And of course, a lot of people say there is no comparison because Vic Beasley didn't have that dog in him, and Nolan Smith absolutely does have that dog. And you'd be 100% true. And I think the dog notion is the reason why Vic Beasley, at the point in his career where he should have been blossoming into a playmaker, like we're talking about potentially with Nolan Smith, is why Vic Beasley's playing in the XFL and why you hope Nolan Smith will be a 10+ sack guy in the NFL. But I think there's another lesson in the Vic Beasley thing beyond just him being a dog, is that there aren't that many successful 240 pound pass rushers in the NFL. It's like Robert Mathis and Haason Reddick. And then beyond that, it's like Samson Ebukam. Like, how many of these guys are out there? And the reason for that is because, these guys are giving up 75, 80 plus pounds of mass to these NFL offensive tackles. Your average NFL offensive tackle is 6'5", 315 pounds. And the average offensive tackle is going to have 34-inch arms versus, in the case of a guy like Nolan Smith or Vic Beasley, 32.5-inch arms. And they're never going to be able to outreach him with various moves. And so that type of pass rusher, a Nolan Smith, a Vic Beasley, is almost always going to have to rely on their speed rush, their fastball, so to speak. And, they're going to kind of be a one-note guy, right? Because they're not going to be able to generate the power that you want to bully a guy that outweighs them by 80 pounds. And they're not going to necessarily, have the link to long arm him and do all these various things. And again, being a one-note speed rusher isn't the end of your NFL career. There's been several guys. Haason Reddick is a great example of a guy that's had a lot of success doing that. Cliff Averill was another example of a player that came into the league primarily as a speed rusher and then over time was able to build up a skill set, even if he was a little bit bigger than 240 pounds coming into the NFL. And if I'm already convinced that it's going to take Nolan Smith, that is 3 to 5 years to develop before he impacts, if I think the same is also true of these bigger edges like Murphy and Van Ness and whoever else, right? Like, if I also think it's going to take them 3 to 5 years, but if they develop, they have the size, they have the power, they're going to have the speed, they're going to have the length. And so theoretically, if they develop and Nolan Smith develops, I'm going to get a better player from one of those guys than I'm going to get from Nolan Smith. And I feel like the rest of the NFL seems to be trending in this direction towards bigger edges. We talked last week about Kayvon Thibodeau was the first time since 2016 when Leonard Floyd was a top 10 pick that we've seen a sub 260-pound edge rusher taken in the top 10. And then you look at the 6 drafts since that Leonard Floyd draft in 2016, there's only been, beyond Kayvon Thibodeau, there's only been 8 sub 260-pound edge rushers taken in round 1. And we've seen some of these smaller guys, and Arnold Ebiketie, who was, billed as a potential first-round pick, slide to round 2. The same thing happened with Azeez Ojulari, Nolan Smith's former teammate at Georgia, the previous year. And I think some of that is due to the Fangio style of defenses that are now becoming more in vogue. These defenses that are playing these split 2 high safety defenses, as opposed to the cover 3 style defenses that was all the rage from the Seahawks and Pete Carroll and Dan Quinn and all that stuff over the previous decade. And with that cover 3 style defense, you can take your big strong safety, your Cam Chancellor, your Keanu Neal, your Jamal Adams, and much more easily move that defender into the box as an 8th defender, or because most of the league plays nickel 65-70% of the time, and therefore you're going to have a 6-man box instead of a 7-man box like you have in base defense, move that guy into the box as your 7th defender oftentimes. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with this, analytics tell us that running success is primarily based off of how many defenders are in the box, as opposed to the innate skill or level of the offensive line, the running back, or the defense, right? That in the events where you have like one of these light boxes, these 6-man boxes in a nickel defense, and the offense has 5 offensive linemen and tight ends, so they have 6 blockers, then you have the running back. And so if the 6 blockers get a hat on the hat, there's nobody really to stop the running back until 10 or more yards down the field when he gets to that 2nd, 3rd level where the safeties are. And so that's the benefit. And you've seen teams, the Saints with Ryan Nielsen, having bigger edges, 265+ pound edges, right? We saw this with the Titans last year, where they had Mario Edwards and DeMarcus Walker, playing edge rusher for them. And those guys are 280+ pounds. So with these lighter boxes that teams are playing with, they're getting bigger up front. And also, Aaron Donald's a great example, Brandon Staley being a Fangio disciple, that works not because the Rams had the biggest front up 4, but you can't get a single hat on Aaron Donald, right? He has to be double teams. And so the math doesn't add up, right? If you have 6 blockers and only 6 defenders, Aaron Donald basically counts as 2 because you need to double team him. So that's how that sort of works. And so when it comes to Nolan Smith, for these reasons, I not only don't think the Falcons are going to seriously entertain taking him at 8, but I also think he could slide in this draft. Now, I could be 100% wrong about this, guys. The Falcons could absolutely fall in love with this football character. Some other team could absolutely fall in this football character and take him high in the draft. It only takes one, is the old adage. But I have a hard time seeing Nolan Smith being a top 15 pick due to these trends that we're seeing in the NFL. Now, maybe Green Bay takes him at 15. I know they're looking for a pass rusher. Tight end, safety is some other pressing needs for them as well. But, especially if they get that 13th overall pick from the Jets, maybe they have the luxury of taking a pass rusher with one of their 2 first-round picks that they will then have. But if Green Bay doesn't take him, I have a hard time seeing anybody else in the top 15, 20 picks taking Nolan Smith. And so he may be the next Azeez Ojulari, the next Arnold Ebiketie, a guy that a lot of people are being a high-end first-round pick that slides maybe into the 20s, maybe even to the 2nd round or something like that. And so, my bold statement of the day is I think there's probably a higher probability that Nolan Smith is going to still be on the clock on day 2 than necessarily be the Falcons pick at 8. But again, we'll see if that prediction is correct. And I'm curious, for all the Georgia fans out there listening, what is it about Nolan Smith? Is it the character? Is it the athleticism? What is it about him that makes you think he's going to beat the odds that we've seen seen other smaller edges kind of fall into this trap and not necessarily impact in the NFL. Curious for you to get your feedback on that, guys, but that's going to leave us here on our Nolan Smith conversation. We'll leave that aside and we'll talk about a player that Nolan Smith may be sacking in the NFL. Had an hour-long chat with Mark Schofield of SB Nation over the weekend about the top quarterbacks in this upcoming draft class, and we'll be sprinkling them in on the podcast throughout the week. I don't know, it may last all week long and maybe a couple of days. We'll see how that goes, but we'll start the conversation with, the proposed QB1 in this draft class, Bryce Young, a player that Nolan Smith is certainly familiar with, the quarterback out of Alabama, and we'll get into that conversation I had with Mark Schofield the other day as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Grand slams, no-hitters, and double plays are back, and there's no better place to get in on the MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That means you get bonus bets back even if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up and claim your no-sweat first bet, and whether you want to bet the spread or money line, you can do whatever you want. I like to bet a little and win a lot with a parlay, and FanDuel has a great parlay builder for baseball. You can combine bets to see who's going to hit a hit, who's going to hit a home run, who's going to get RBIs, so the next time Orlando Arcia, has that walk-off RBI, not only are you going to be cheering because the Braves win, but you also might make a little bit of money on the side with that. So don't miss your chance for your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you join FanDuel today. Head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of the Major League Baseball. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are back here on Locked On Falcons with another illustrious guest, Mark Schofield, making his mini appearance. I don't know. It feels like so many appearances. And with Mark, he's my go-to guy to talk about the quarterback position. He always does a great job breaking it down in ways that are understandable for those people that are not always sort of neck deep in, quarterback evaluation. And of course, today we're going to be talking about sort of the top 4 quarterbacks in this draft class. And let's sort of jump right into it, Mark, with Bryce Young, right? The sort of consensus QB1 for most people in this draft class. And the thing I like about Bryce Young, despite all the concerns about his size, there is no flinch with him when he's in the pocket under fire. He will have a 300-pound defender bearing down on him. He will throw in his face and somehow, some way manages to get the ball to the right spot. And it seems like his superpower is just being able to make things happen, not even when it's necessarily there. And I think that was a big part of his success this past year, because we know historically Alabama has been loaded with talent, not quite to the same degree this past year, but yet you still saw Bryce Young over and over and over again rise to the occasion. Is my assessment of Bryce Young pretty spot on?
It's pretty spot on. I might be the person to sort of say, well, he's not quite consensus QB1 for me because I have somebody that's my QB1, but he's like QB1B. And I think it's important to sort of preface this entire conversation with, I generally like all 4 of these top 4 big 4 quarterbacks. I think, Will Levis, for example, needs some more work, perhaps a lot more work than the other 3. But I can see a path for each of them to have NFL success to varying degrees. With Young, though, the assessment is spot on. He plays without fear, absolutely no fear in the pocket, can handle multiple points of pressure in the pocket, which is very impressive for, let's face it, a quarterback of his size. The frame discussion is going to be part of his evaluation. JT O'Sullivan earlier this week was on with me at Comms. He talked about, look, when he was playing, he was perhaps 35, 40 pounds bigger than Bryce Young, and he felt beat up all the time. So how's Bryce Young going to handle that? Well, how he handles it, as JT points out, and as we can see on film, he's very good at protecting himself, very good at moving in the pocket, but he doesn't just move to protect himself. He moves to create explosive plays in the passing game, and that's where this game is trending, right? This game is trended towards athleticism, creativity. The days of like, give me a perfect 5-step drop, hitch and throw, you don't need to do that. Like wherever if you watch him at Alabama, if you watch how that offense is structured, it was generally get to this spot in the pocket. We don't care really how you get there. and then make a throw, find somebody, keep your eyes downfield, and create. He does it extremely well. I think wherever he ends up, there will obviously have to be some things that are done structurally, conceptually. You'd like to have a pretty good offensive line in front of him, but you'd like to have a good offensive line really for any quarterback. But he's so creative, so explosive. Not that he's Patrick Mahomes, but you can see a similar style of play. He doesn't have the Mahomes arm or anything like that, but there's a similar style of play. And so he's a fascinating prospect, very talented. And I have, almost no reservations about drafting him even first overall, if that's what Carolina wants to do.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, the knocks on Bryce Young are the size concerns, right? And it's probably not so much the height, because we've seen short quarterbacks succeed a lot more in recent years than historically. And so I don't think NFL teams are as concerned about having a 5'10" quarterback as they used to be. Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield kind of, we've seen those guys go number one overall. And so clearly that's not an issue. The main concern with Bryce Young seems to be the weight issue. Yeah. And, he measured in at 204. No one believes that that's his playing weight.
Absolutely not. I mean, let's be honest there. That man's playing at like 190.
And the reason why that's a concern for those of you is I think and I'm curious, Mark, if you would echo these sentiments, it's a question of durability, right? That when you're in the NFL and you're a quarterback, you're going to get hit, right? You play behind the best offensive line, you're still going to get hit multiple times every single game, even if they don't result in sacks. And if you play behind a bad offensive line, and Falcon fans that are listening know well about this, and Matt Ryan for several years over the last decade was the most hit quarterback in the NFL. And if he wasn't one, he was in the top 3 or 4 every single year. That those hits accumulate, and you worry about the durability concerns. We did see a minor issue with Bryce Young with a shoulder injury this past year, but you do wonder, with the punishment that he is potentially going to have in the NFL, are those issues going to be a much bigger deal on Sundays than they were on Saturdays? But obviously the pushback is, look, he managed to survive pretty well in the SEC. That's the most physical, conference by far in college football. So while it is a concern, it may not necessarily be something that anybody should be too worried about. Where do you sort of stand on that issue?
Yeah, it generally where I go with it, Aaron, he's got two things that are sort of in his favor that help him. One is the fact that he's so good at avoiding the big hit, generally speaking, right? Now, look, there are some that you can't avoid as a quarterback. Like, you can't avoid like a blindside missed block that you don't see coming. But when he's running in the open field, for example, when he's creating, as we just talked about, he's very good. It's a Lamar Jackson-esque style of play. One of the things that I loved about Lamar coming out of Louisville, and even now in Baltimore or wherever he ends up next year, he's very good at, he'll give up a potential big play to dip out of bounds or to slide or avoid contact. And Bryce Young does that very well as well. Like, he'll dip out of bounds, he'll slide, he'll protect himself. And so he's learned, part of the process of being an undersized quarterback is you learn how to sort of protect yourself, how to take care of yourself. So he's very good at that. So that's one reason. The other thing he's very good at, particularly in terms of a college quarterback coming up, he's very good at seeing what's happening on the outside, on the boundary, on the periphery, right? I mentioned earlier, sometimes you can't see a blindside hit coming, but you might be able to see that potential arise pre-snap. You might be able to see sort of a potential corner blitz, slot blitz. And like, he's been very good at Alabama at seeing that stuff pre-snap and then either checking down or getting out of it or attacking it and even replacing the blitz with the ball. That's certainly going to help him. If he were a quarterback, there were some other quarterbacks, even quarterbacks that I liked coming out, that struggled with that. If he had that kind of, background and had that sort of struggle and seeing peripheral pressure pre-snap, then I'd be a little bit worried. Like, yeah, there's going to be a moment where it's 3rd and 7, he gets lit up and it doesn't see it coming. He's got that ability. And the final aspect is scheme, right? If you're drafting Bryce Young, you're not going to use him like Jalen Hurts. You're not going to use him as like a power runner between the tackles. Jalen Hurts is a very strong, powerful runner, even though he's a bit sort of technically undersized at the position. Bryce Young's a different player. You're probably not going to use him that much in the run game, at least between the tackles. You might get him on the edges. You might try to get him to the outside. You might do something schematically, like with an arc block in front of him to give him a little bit of a convoy. You might not leave him sort of exposed to hits in the run game. And so I think whatever team drafts it will probably pick their spots with him in the run game, but they're not going to sort of put him in situations like you see with the Eagles where they're going to expose him to more hits. And so, I think the height issue, like you said, it's not a concern. He does a very good job at finding throwing lanes. You can see examples of him attacking over the middle, so I'm not worried about that. It's more the frame issue, and I think between how he protects himself, what he does pre-snap, and how his NFL team probably uses him schematically, there are ways to mitigate that concern.
Now, I know you're not a big fan of player comps, but the world needs their player comps.
The world needs their comps. I get it.
And obviously, when you see a short quarterback, you go two places. To the most successful short quarterbacks we've seen in recent years. No offense to Doug Flutie, all right? Most people don't go back that far.
Unfortunately, I do, my friend.
I do as well. So, but you look at Russell Wilson, you look at Drew Brees. We know Wilson has that sort of running around ability to make plays off structure and just sort of flick it downfield to Tyler Lockett for a 40-yard touchdown. We've seen him do that so many times, not so much in recent years. But you see that sort of element with Bryce Young, as we've discussed. And then you also sort of see the poise and whatnot from Drew Brees and the accuracy. So I'm just curious on that spectrum of, playmaker versus, pocket surgeon or whatever. Do you see Bryce Young's game veering on one side of the spectrum, or does he, especially if you're, I know people out there that are big fans of Bryce Young, they probably think it's kind of the best of both worlds. So I'm just curious, where do you kind of fall?
Yeah, that's kind of where I end up on it. It's kind of like the best of both worlds. At his best at Alabama, and what you're hoping for when you draft him is somebody with sort of the playmaking skills of Russell Wilson, particularly off structure outside the pocket, creating downfield, because that's one of the things that I think he does very well in conjunction with the quarterback that I have as QB1 is when he breaks the pocket, he'll still create downfield, whereas my QB1 needs to do more of that. But you also have the sort of cerebral process of a Drew Brees. Bryce Young's very good, as I mentioned, sort of peripheral stuff, reading things out, reading concepts out, working through progressions and things like that, moving defenders with his eyes. So it is sort of his ceiling is the best of those two, which you're basically saying he's a Hall of Fame quarterback when you do that, which is why I always sort of hesitate with comps. I also do appreciate the sort of Steph Curry point guard comps that you see out there on Twitter and elsewhere, because that's also something he does extremely well. It is sort of create with his vision as a quarterback, because even when he's got interior pressure and pressure off both edges, the eyes are still downfield and he's scanning for targets. And interesting enough, we recorded this a couple of days after we saw a video of him playing basketball and, put in a no-look pass right on somebody for an easy, uncontested layup. And part of me wonders if he did that just because, look, people are saying I'm Steph Curry, I'm a point guard. I'm going to show them, but yeah, I'm a point guard on the court too. But yeah, he's extremely talented. And I think you're hoping you get that sort of best of both worlds, because part of the drawback to Wilson in recent years, at least, is he might be lacking sort of that Breeze aspect to this combination. Young has shown that he at least has it right now.
Yeah. So Falcon fans listening, hopefully we're both very wrong on Bryce Young if he happens to be the pick for the Carolina Panthers. And he
right. Hopefully, I mean, if you're an Atlanta fan, listen to this. You're hoping that we're absolutely wrong. You're hoping this is Mark Schofield's Josh Rosen moment from a couple years ago, because we all have our misses, and Rosen stands out as perhaps my biggest. Yeah, you're hoping that it ends up going completely south in a hurry.
Yeah. So for the Falcons, it's the main question on Bryce Young is, if you beat him up, does he struggle to stay on the field? So let's go out there and get some guys that can beat him up.
Exactly.
So you mentioned your QB1, and speaking of Josh Rosen, QB1, right?
Oh, goodness gracious. You had to dig that in one last time, my friend.
Hey, look, he was my QB1 too. So we're
I mean, there will be books written. There'll be a Netflix docuseries about Draft Twitter, the 2018 quarterback class. I'm going to go pitch that to them as soon as we get done here.
There you go. All right, guys, that is going to do it. Thank Mark Schofield of SB Nation for joining me on today's episode to talk about Bryce Young, and we'll continue the conversation. I'm sure we'll talk at least with Mark about CJ Stroud on tomorrow's episode. Maybe we'll also get in the Anthony Richardson, Will Levis conversation as well, or that maybe later in the week. We'll also have some other guests coming up later in the week to talk specifically about players and prospects they hope the Falcons will target. So we'll get all of that all week long. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes podcast. Joe Marino, Kyle Krabs are breaking down what it takes to build a successful NFL franchise every single day. And you can find the Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes podcast wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.